In my previous video on the 1960 presidential election, I mentioned how Lyndon B. Johnson was initially against passing civil rights legislation. During the 1956 Democratic National Convention, he explicitly stated, "I am not now and never have been an advocate of civil rights. I don't think I ever will be." It was not surprising that Johnson felt this way, given that the core base of the Democratic Party in the 1950s was in the segregated South. Thus, it was actually destructive to the party's electoral prospects when, in 1964, then-President Johnson eventually signed the Civil Rights Act into law. LBJ even admitted he was crippling the party's core constituency, saying to an aide after signing the legislation, "We have lost the South for a generation." So, why was Lyndon B. Johnson willing to weaken the Democratic Party's electoral chances? Did he simply have a change of heart? Was racial equality so morally important to him all of a sudden? Or did something else motivate Johnson to change direction? To put his about-face into perspective, it helps to recall that, in fact, the civil rights movement wasn't particularly popular during the 1960s. For instance, the famous 1963 March on Washington and Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech is today recognized as one of the most memorable moments in U.S. history. But at the time, it was a widely unpopular demonstration. A poll at the time found that only 23% of Americans had a favorable view of holding such a civil rights demonstration in the nation's capital. Furthermore, even late into the civil rights movement, in 1966, when a different poll asked white respondents if they felt demonstrators by Black Americans on civil rights had helped more or hurt more in advancing the cause of racial equality, only 15% said they helped, while 85% said they hurt. Yet, despite the lack of public support for civil rights, Lyndon B. Johnson still acquiesced and signed a series of monumental laws for racial equality, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So why was the civil rights movement so successful? How could it achieve such a series of legislative victories, despite a lack of enthusiasm for racial equality among most Americans, and despite the president's own inclinations and political history? The answer may come as a surprise, but it is really quite simple. The civil rights movement succeeded because of the existence of the Soviet Union. During the 1950s and 60s, the United States was, of course, in the middle of the Cold War. Presidents like Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson were forced to act on civil rights not out of genuine moral concern for racial equality, but rather to save face on the world stage. The widely televised civil rights protests, not the gross injustices that made them necessary, were considered harmful to the country's veneer of moral superiority. As Mary Duziak writes in her informative book, Cold War Civil Rights, early efforts to pass civil rights legislation by the political elite were, in large part, motivated by a desire to placate foreign critics. The Cold War was a war of ideas fought at a time when many African and Asian countries had only recently gained independence from their Western European colonizers. Many were deliberating whether to side with the Soviet or the US bloc. Having images of Black Americans' violent suppression circulating in the media was certainly not going to help the United States in its appeal to these newly formed nations, which were predominantly made of people of color. The high-profile terrorization of Black Americans made the communist cause more attractive. As the British newspaper The Observer noted in 1949, "The color bar is the greatest propaganda gift any country could give the Kremlin in its persistent bid for the affections of the colored races of the world." In 1947, President Harry Truman's Committee on Civil Rights reported that domestic civil rights status was a serious hindrance to achieving its foreign policy goals. The committee concluded that our foreign policy is designed to make the United States an enormous positive influence for peace and progress throughout the world, but our domestic civil rights shortcomings are a serious obstacle. The United States is not so strong, the final triumph of democratic ideal is not so inevitable that we can ignore what the world thinks of us or our record. Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, also noted that the existence of discrimination against minority groups in this country has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. We are reminded over and over by some foreign newspapers and spokesmen that our treatment of various minorities leave much to be desired. Atchison also said that racial discrimination in the United States remains a source of constant embarrassment to this government in its day-to-day conduct of its foreign relations, and it jeopardizes the effective maintenance of our moral leadership of the free and democratic nations of the world. Even a certifiable racist like Harry Truman, a Missourian Southern Democrat who frequently used the N-word, recognized how important this issue was in promoting the United States' image as a free and democratic nation. To whitewash America's original sin in the aftermath of World War II, Truman signed an executive order in 1948 to desegregate the U.S. military. By today's standards, this may seem like a very modest concession, but in the election year of 48, when Truman faced threats of insurrection from Dixiecrats like the third-party presidential candidate Strom Thurmond, even this change was a politically risky gambit. What is important to recognize is that Truman's willingness to take this political gamble was more indicative of the threat he was facing from overseas. Of course, these attempts to quote-unquote clean house domestically were not enough to restore the country's international prestige. The Soviet Union and its sympathizers continued to highlight the immorality and viciousness of the institutionalized racial discrimination in the United States. The Soviets often deflected critiques of their own human rights violations with propaganda catchphrases like, "And you are lynching Negroes." They also invited civil rights activists to the Soviet Union, including the early pioneer Pauli Murray, to make propaganda films about the oppressive life led by the vast majority of African Americans. The blistering image of the U.S. created by Soviet propaganda alarmed Washington. In 1949, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow reported that the Soviet press consistently highlighted racial discrimination in the U.S. They wrote that the Negro question was one of the principal Soviet propaganda themes regarding the United States. The Soviet press hammers away unceasingly on such things as lynch laws, segregation, racial discrimination, deprivation of political rights, etc., seeking to build up a picture of an America in which the Negroes are brutally downridden with no hope of improving their status under the existing form of government. Congressman and later Senator Jacob Javits of New York also warned in 1950, with communist China as a propaganda base, segregation and discrimination on grounds of race, creed, or color in the United States can be used to win tens of millions to the communist cause. During the 1960 presidential election, the Republican nominee for the race, Richard Nixon, explicitly linked the need for civil rights to the national security structure. If the U.S. did not achieve racial equality, Nixon warned, it would lose the struggle for the hearts and minds of the world's peoples. If we trace the various steps made in the progress of the civil rights cause, we see, at nearly every turn, the looming shadow of Soviet pressure. For instance, in the 1950s, President Eisenhower initially refrained from publicly endorsing Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. It wasn't until images of the Arkansas National Guard blocking 9 black students from entering a segregated high school were broadcast around the world that the Republican president sent in federal paratroopers to escort the Little Rock Nine. Referring to the Little Rock crisis, Eisenhower specifically recognized how the image could undermine U.S. efforts in the Cold War, saying, it could continue to feed the mill of Soviet propagandists who by word and picture were telling the world of the racial terror in the United States. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, echoed this idea in a letter to Eisenhower. Here at the United Nations, he wrote, I can see clearly the harm the riots in Little Rock are doing to our foreign relations. More than 2/3 of the world is non-white, and the reaction of the representatives of these people is easy to see. I suspect that we lost several votes on the Chinese Communist item because of Little Rock. Acclaimed historian Gerald Horne noted that the fact that the Brown ruling came in the concerted government campaign against international and domestic communism is the most overlooked aspect of the decision. Even James Baldwin observed in his classic, The Fire Next Time, that most Negroes I know do not believe that this immense concession would ever have been made if it had not been for the competition of the Cold War. Concern over communist propaganda continued when Kennedy succeeded Eisenhower. 1960, the year of Kennedy's election, is known as the Year of Africa because 17 African nations gained independence from colonial powers. Although Kennedy had little interest in civil rights when he took office, he was troubled by the way the foreign press covered atrocities such as the savage beatings of the Freedom Riders by white supremacist mobs. Kennedy felt that the Freedom Riders were embarrassing him and the country on the eve of an important meeting in Vienna with Soviet Premier Khrushchev. From a public relations perspective, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was also concerned about the demonstrations against segregation, saying, "It's bad for the country, it's bad for us around the world." In 1963, viewers around the world saw footage of children being fire-hosed and attacked by police dogs during the famous Birmingham protests of that year. In the aftermath, Secretary of State Dean Rusk pushed Kennedy and Johnson for a new civil rights law. Rusk warned that if Congress should not approve legislation designed to remove remaining discriminatory practices, questions would inevitably rise in many parts of the world as to the real convictions of the American people. In that event, hostile propaganda might be expected to hurt us more than it has hurt us until now. After Birmingham, Senator Jacob Javits also cautioned the Kennedy-Johnson administration that the propaganda value of what has happened can only help those who are opposed to our free institutions, and is unfortunately a forceful incentive to them to propagating communism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The organizers of the civil rights movement were also well aware that the moral arguments for their cause alone would not persuade the government to act on racial equality. They were actively utilizing Cold War politics to their advantage. The civil rights movement had a series of momentous victories in large part due to their efforts to leverage the nation's concern over its international prestige. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the NAACP and the Civil Rights Congress petitioned the United Nations with now famous speeches like, "We charge genocide." Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, threatened to appeal the Commission of Human Rights of the UN to pressure Eisenhower to take action against lynchings in the South. These actions led to the civil rights movement's peak in the 1960s when influential figures like Malcolm X and James Baldwin made trips overseas and embarrassed the United States by speaking out against the actual state of racial discrimination back home. Displays of international solidarity accompanied the 1963 March on Washington as regional protests occurred at several U.S. embassies and consulates. According to civil rights leader James Farmer, the Freedom Riders intentionally tried to attract white supremacist mobs in the hopes that it would create a situation that was headline news all over the world and affected the nation's image abroad. An international crisis. That was our strategy. But the civil rights movement was only able to exploit the Cold War politics to fight for racial justice to a certain point. Once the cause started to shift towards black power, class struggle, and anti-imperialism around the late 1960s, the liberal establishment aimed to crush the movement. A turning point came when Martin Luther King Jr. condemned the Vietnam War and launched the Poor People's Campaign. The civil rights movement became a threat to capitalism and was shut down by liberals in the North. Prominent Democrats began to vilify King as a traitor, and the civil rights leader was virtually excommunicated by LBJ. And the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was tapped to send undercover agents to infiltrate and sabotage the Poor People's Campaign in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Washington. Civil rights activist and future Congressman John Lewis was also considered traitorous after he spoke out in 1966 against the Vietnam War at the memorial dinner of the Council for American-Soviet Friendship. In other words, when the civil rights movement exploited Cold War politics only for racial equality, it aligned with the liberal agenda to contain communism, since racial discrimination was an international embarrassment to their propaganda war against the Soviet Union. But as soon as leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis started to align more closely with the enemies of the US and capitalism, such as expressing solidarity for the Vietnamese liberation cause, then liberals felt the need to contain communism by shutting down the civil rights movement instead. Nevertheless, the existence of the Cold War is what created the circumstances that made the civil rights movement possible. And it is important to recognize this fact since it may explain why more recent struggles for racial equality have not been so successful. When the Black Lives Matter movement reached its peak during the summer of 2020, 15 to 26 million people took to the streets in an uprising for racial justice that was far larger than any protest movement in American history. Moreover, unlike the civil rights cause, which enjoyed only modest public support, BLM in June 2020 had an approval rating of 67%. Yet, Black Lives Matter failed in its stated goals of either reforming or defunding the police state, and ending qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. Black Americans are still being killed by the police at a higher rate than other racial groups. BLM did not take place amidst the post-Cold War political environment overshadowed by a fear of an international quote-unquote communist threat. And that, more than anything, might explain its failure. But as American hegemony starts to decline, and China and the BRICS nations gain power and influence, the United States may once again have to start caring about its international reputation. The rise of a multipolar world may force the US to bring its domestic politics in line with the image it wants to project to the world. And this may help advance the cause of social justice. The Cold War gave the civil rights cause an opening. Thus, for those of us who are committed to the fight for racial equality, we should welcome a return to a multipolar world and the decline of the American empire.